We look cute. She usually come post up on here anyway.
Doing a little fun?
Mm-hmm. She'll make her way.
That's cute.
Black Power Baptiste.
Black Power, y'all.
What's up? Welcome to the Revolutionary Book Trap. We back. Has it been 2 weeks?
It's been 2 weeks.
It hasn't felt like 2 weeks.
It flew by.
We starting our new book, y'all. We got our new book today. I hope y'all ready. I hope y'all been reading. And if you don't have your copy of the PDF, the free PDF, please make sure you go. Well, you can put into the comments right here that you would like access to the PDF, and we can get that to you. We want to give a chance for the audience, for the viewership to build. So make sure y'all share in your groups, on your timeline. Let everybody know that Black Camera's Revolutionary Book Trap has begun. How you feeling today, comrade? You feeling good?
I feel good.
You should feel freaking fantastical today. If you didn't know, on yesterday, the Atlanta chapter, we hosted our first Atlanta food drive, which was led by Comrade Nyah. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the food drive, Comrade. How was the food drive?
Well, we got off to a little bit of a rough start because our original location didn't have any people. So we had to relocate. But one of our comrades was on top of it and told us about this place where the people were, and we went there. And
who participated? Like, who was there?
Oh my God, we had like 13 comrades to come out. We had Comrade Angelica, we had Comrade Summer, we had Comrade Terry. You were there. I was there. Ghazi was there. Muhammadu was there. Comrade Muhammadu was there. Diamond was there. Garcia was there. We had other ones.
Did you name Summer?
Yes.
Summer. So we had comrades. Diamond came with her friend.
Jamal.
This was crazy. So Diamond hit me up on Instagram about the food drive or whatever, and she had told me that her friend Jamal was driving down from DC, and she roped him in basically to come and participate. So he joined us, and then we also had two of my co-workers, Xavier and Grant, who was there as well too. So
I mean, it was so dope just having all of us out there and just the forces. I mean, and I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. My wife was there too, but we had problems with parking and everything, so, but she was there, and that's all that
Black
matters.
Power, Robert. How many people did we feed?
Almost 100 people.
Child, as soon as we pulled up to the park, like, all of the food, like, it just went like that.
Got to the park.
Yeah.
I mean, but we got there and got to the park and handed out more plates. Also, I want to shout out my friend Tony, because he helped us with the soup, and it was just, we had a lot of.
What did we have? What did we do serve?
So we served curry chicken, rice, cornbread, and sweet potatoes.
It was lit, y'all. But I mean, aside from, just being able to, give these meals to our homeless brothers and sisters, we were able to, make them feel appreciated, make them feel, loved on, and things of that nature, because we understand that when we look at homeless African and indigenous people, we're looking at a discarded, sector of our nation. And, not at any consequence of our own, but, just living under capitalism, living under colonialism. When you look at poverty, it only reinforces the notion that for like a handful to be rich and prosperous, such as the white bourgeoisie, the masses of people have to live in poverty.
Yes.
And, just like we say with all of our food drives, we don't do this as an act of charity. We do this with the understanding that our homeless brothers and sisters can be organized and they can be included within, you know, the revolution. And not only can they be, it's necessary, and they are needed to participate in the you know, in the revolution. So that's what we wanted to convey. We gave them brochures that spoke about Black Hammer, numbers that they could contact, you know, if they had access to a phone, and how they could get involved with the organization, because we need all of our African brothers and sisters and indigenous brothers and sisters to participate in this process.
Absolutely.
So we are planning our next one for this month. We plan on doing it each month. Shout out to Comrade Angelica, who volunteered to cook. Comrade Summer, who volunteered to cook. I'm going to cook. My partner, Donnell, is going to cook. His best friend is going to cook. So Diamond's going to cook. So it's just really, really, really popping off. So yeah, Black Power. So our new book.
Oh, wow.
How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it was written by our brother, Walter Rodney. And, well, before we get into that, we also want to say, hashtag what's on your shelf. Tell us what you're reading right now. Some years ago, I don't know who has heard of Children of Blood and Bone, which is written by Tomi Adeyemi. I might be mispronouncing her last name, but she's getting ready to release the second book. And if you didn't know, Children of Blood and Bone is this Afrocentric, like fantasy type, type book storyline. I'm a huge fan of fantasy, magic, spells, all of that type of shit like that. Yeah. Dia loves that. So you have this, it's a story that we've never seen before about, African people with magical, mystical powers and things of that nature. She's coming out with the second book that's it's called Children of Virtue and Revenge or something of that nature. But if you haven't heard about it, I say look it up. So hashtag that's what's going to be on my bookshelf. So
I got a couple of them that I've been wanting to read. Mine is Black Power Blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
A blueprint for Black Power. Amos Wilson.
Yeah. Okay.
And I have not read it, but I really want to get to it. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, Black Power. Thank you for sharing, Comrade Chikonde. All right, so we want to give y'all a few facts about our author, Brother Walter Rodney, who wrote this book. And so Comrade Nyah is going to tell y'all a couple of things.
Yeah, so y'all, Walter Rodney is the author of this book that we're about to read. And, I didn't know anything about Walter Rodney, and, neither did my comrade. So we kind of looked him up to kind of see, for him to put, already, this book is so intense and there's a lot of information in it. And just the way it's written, it's just, you can tell it's a certain level of, it's just a totally different caliber of an author.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but Walter Rodney was from Guyana, and he wrote this book and was clearly anti-colonial. He earned a PhD in African history in 1966 at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, England, at the age of 24. And his dissertation focused on the slave trade in Upper Guinea Coast. And that was published at the Oxford University Press in 1970. It says that Rodney traveled widely and became very well known internationally as an activist, scholar, and a formidable orator. We were trying to find out if he was related, to any type organization, and let's see, he taught at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. That's Africa. Mm-hmm. Let's see. And so he has a long history of serving and the things that he did. But the thing that really stood out to us was that he was assassinated. So my comrade was like, well, he was assassinated. I was like, whoa. And a lot of our scholars are assassinated. It's nothing new for us. It says on June 13th, 1980, he was killed in Georgetown at the age of 38 by a bomb in his car. a month after returning from celebrations during the independence of Zimbabwe in a time of intense political activism. He was survived by his wife Patricia and 3 children. His brother Donald Rodney, who was injured by the explosion, said that a sergeant in the Guyana Defense Force named Gregory Smith had given Walter the bomb that killed him. After the killing, Smith fled to French Guyana.
I think that's
Is that Guyana?
Guyana.
Yeah, it's Guyana.
Okay.
Guyana. And where he died in 2002. And it's widely believed, but not proven, that the assassination was set up by Guyana's president, Lyndon Forbes Burnham. Rodney believed that the various ethnic groups that had been historically disenfranchised by the ruling colonial class should work together, which was in conflict with Burnham.
So obviously we know that the assassination was carried out by this president.
By the state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Comrade Gigi. Make sure you shared and put hashtag shared in the comments if you haven't shared it just yet. But yeah, we just wanted to open it up with some, a few facts about our author. As you can see, just even by the title, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, you can understand how that would put a lot of, the white ruling class on edge. And, just like Comrade Nyah just read, this brother was assassinated because he stood in opposition of what, white imperialism is. So therefore, we already see the historical trajectory of, white imperialist powers going after, African scholars who are bringing up these different questions, because when the masses are confronted with, different questions around, development, how things have come into place as they stand now, you have to go back into history to understand exactly how it's been, how it has become this way. And therefore, that's going to incite, this feeling, this sense of rebellion, to basically return to a better way of life that was interrupted by capitalism and colonialism. And white imperialist powers just simply can't stand for that.
No, and I mean, it's at stake. I mean, they know it's at stake, which Rodney goes into here.
Right, exactly.
And I mean, just within this first bit that we've gotten into thus far, he dropped so much knowledge. And you had mentioned something about our scholars, and I know we're not talking about other scholars right now, but it's just, I've always questioned, Amos Wilson and how he died. And I mean, it wasn't said that he was assassinated, but it was just the things that he wrote about and how he brought the developmental psychology of the black child and just other things. And then he just kind of died mysteriously. And that's never sat well with me. But
right. But as what we see so far from just all we did was get into the first 13 pages of chapter 1. So we understand already that if you have read, and please, if you don't have the PDF, let us know so we can get that to you. But it is a very comprehensive read. There were a couple of sections that both me and Conrad and I had to go over, a couple of times just to make sure that we were internalizing it and understanding it. And I just really feel, I just really feel that everybody should be able to participate, with this book in particular, because it's laying down a lot of historical facts, and it just gives us a really deep understanding, of today's world, by drawing on not only from what we've known from the past 600 colonial years, but even beyond that. And just starting off with the chapter, let's get into the chapter. You ready?
Let's do it.
Okay, so starting off, what Walter Rodney begins with is just basically he asks the question, what is development? And so therefore he leads us on a discussion, about development in human society, and you know exactly what that means. And so one important part that he speaks to is where he says, and it's in our caption as well, development in the past has always meant the increase in the ability to guard the independence of the social group and indeed to infringe upon the freedom of others, something that often came from irrespective of the will of the persons within the society involved. So, he summarizes that, pretty much in early times, man, out of the context of, race, which we understand is a colonial construct or whatever, but, just the basic understanding that, man found it, more convenient to even hunt together in groups, this sense of communalism. And then he goes into, how the relationships in these social groups, are critical to the development, to the understanding of what that society is going to mature into. And, it's deep as hell. Did you have something to add? All right.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much summed it up, but I mean, I'm thinking about like tying it into the economy of that tribe or that group of people, and basically it's like two sides of the coin. You have social development as well as economic development, and I appreciated how he broke that down.
And he says, of course, each social group comes into contact with others. The relations between individuals and any two societies are regulated by the form of the two societies. So, for example, when you have us, African people in Africa, situated in our societies, versus Europe society, and how they came to Africa, and stole us away, enslaved us, and things of that nature. You have to think of, what were the social structures within Europe before they decided to come to Africa? What were the social structures in Africa before we were faced with, the invasion of, European, colonizers and things of that nature? And he says their respective political structures are important because the ruling elements within each group are the ones that begin to have dialogue, trade, or fight as the case may be. And we already understand that Europe came to Africa already with the understanding that they wanted to steal Africans, they wanted to enslave us, versus African people who were living in, different social structures, based in communalism and things of that nature, confronted with Europeans who came with guns, all of these different types of weapons. They came out of necessity to pull themselves up out of disease and poverty and all of these different things, while African people were living in the abundance of the land. And that's not to say that, African people prior to that didn't have, contradictions with, structure, things and, things of that nature. But before we could even solve those contradictions, we were faced with, this invasion of the Europeans. And just outside of that context, what Brother Walter is laying out is just the understanding of how, two societies, how they relate to each other and what that means. So basically, he begins the chapter by, laying all of that out. And, he even goes into speaking about the tools, which the tools with which men work. And I highlighted this part where he says the tools which men work in the manner in which they organize their labor are both important indices of social development. So, yeah.
And that stood out to me because he outlines that these tools were meant to either help us protect ourselves from real enemies, other human enemies, or they were meant to help us to survive natural disasters. And so, the betterment of our quality of life as we develop different tools and everything he, just puts that in the middle of what development was. As human society developed, we came up with better tools, we were able to survive natural disasters, and we were able to better protect ourselves against other enemies, which, like you had mentioned before, within Africa, that's not to say we didn't have our own contradictions and how we dealt with one another and things of that sort. However, Europe did what it did because it was living in the state in which it was living, and as a material gain, it came over eventually and basically colonized Africa and took over the land.
So yeah, he pretty much he lays that out, gives us an understanding of that. And then also, and this is just the first 13 pages of the chapter, y'all. So you can understand that it's a lot that this brother is summarizing and, providing understanding on. Another part, like early on in this chapter that stood out to me was where he says, but the overall tendency was towards increased production, and at any given points of time, the increase in the quantity of goods was associated with a change in the quality or character of society. Meaning that if you live in a society that was able to produce an abundance of things, it made it possible for there to be other social changes. So, like, for example, if you had a society that was producing an abundance of food, then there was it freed up people to, it freed up human beings, man, to participate in other aspects of society. Therefore, you had the development of arts, you had the development of philosophy, you had the development of music, and all of these different things. But you have to understand that even within those structures, the majority of the labor was carried out by the masses of the people. And so when you have the masses of the people creating this, this quantity of products and goods and all of those other things like that, you have that sector of the society that is alleviated to be able to participate in all of these different things. And therefore, you're faced with the advent of, of these different classes of, like the bourgeoisie and things of that nature. You have the advent of people who are able to finance, these different things or whatever, and therefore they become the few that manage, the masses. And that's pretty much what Walter Rodney is laying out.
I like his example too, like on page 5. I'm not sure exactly
it's on page 4 for me.
Yeah, I like the example he used with China, and he talks about what they started out, everything you just laid out, and then he goes into a small section of Chinese society came to take a disproportionate share of the proceeds of human labor, and that was a section which did least to actually generate the wealth by working in agriculture or the industry.
Right. And he says, development was universal because the conditions leading to economic expansion were universal. Everywhere, man was faced with the task of survival by meeting fundamental material needs, and better tools were a consequence of the interplay between human beings and nature as a part of the struggle for survival. Of course, human history is not a record of advances and nothing else. There were periods in every part of the world where there were temporary setbacks and actual reduction of the capacity to produce basic necessities and other services for the population. Right. So, it's deep, y'all.
So if y'all have read that back that stood out to you, please post it in the comment section, because we kind of want to get into this because it's a lot of information.
Yeah, it is.
So if you ever read that back, please post it in the comments so we can discuss.
And then I also want to read this part too, because, it just goes back to what we were laying out earlier, where, just understanding that the goods produced, were produced by the masses, and then you have this sector of society that is able to basically pretty much, adventure into all of these different things. And it says, the goods produced at the stage were divided more or less equally among the members of society who lived and worked in families. And this goes off to the example that Comrade Nyah was just speaking to, and it says, by the time of the Tang Dynasty of the 7th century A.D., China had expanded its economic capacity not only to grow more food, but to also manufacture a wide variety of items such as silk, porcelain, ships, and scientific devices. This, of course, represented a quantitative increase in the goods produced, and it was interrelated by qualitative changes in Chinese society. So, if you have all these goods being produced, and then you're able to produce things like, like luxury items, I guess pretty much, with silk, porcelain, ships, and scientific devices. And then, so when you have, the masses of the people that are producing, for society, you have, these so-called how do you say, like, artisan folks and all of that other kind of stuff like that, who therefore place themselves upon, you know, this above everybody else. And then you have then that's when you have the bourgeoisie, and then you have the working class people. Because if with all of this quantitative change, meaning this surplus of goods, qualitative change, you know, that how do we interact with each other now? You work in the fields, you're producing these goods, while I'm the daughter or the son of someone who creates music, or someone who is a tailor who is taking the products that are used by the masses of the people who are working and turn it into something of luxury, you know, for pretty much the ruling class, the ruling sectors of that society. So, yeah. Also, so let's see, where else? He says, through careful study, it's possible to comprehend some of the very complicated links between the changes in the economic base and changes in the rest of the superstructure of society, including the sphere of ideology and social beliefs. The change over from communalism in Asia and Europe led, for instance, to the change of behavior peculiar to feudalism. So, I highlighted that part, but I'm going to go on a little further, where he says, the conduct of the European knights in armor had much in common with that of Japanese samurai or warriors. They developed notions of so-called chivalry, conduct, becoming a gentleman knight on horseback, while in contrast, the peasant had to learn extreme humility, difference in
obsequious. Oh my goodness.
Obsequiousness or whatever.
Obsequence is the base word. I looked it up.
Symbolized by doffing his cap and standing bareheaded before his superiors. In Africa, too, it was to be found that the rise of the state and superior classes led to the practice whereby common subjects prostrated themselves in the presence of the monarchs and aristocrats. When that point had been reached, it became clear that the rough equality of the family had given way to a new state of society. Meaning that now this small group of people, you know, have, you know, been able to dictate themselves over the masses, over the wealth of the masses that have been produced by, you know, the masses of people. And what Walter does is he lays this context down even prior to Europe coming to Africa. So that's just to say, like, for example, you know, some people like to argue, well, you know, slavery existed in, you know, in Africa before Europeans came and all that other kind of stuff like that. And we're not trying to negate from that, because we understand that, you know, all societies, you know, have contradictions and things of that nature. But what material reality tells us is that what Europe was able to do, you know, when enslaving African people, murdering the indigenous people of, you know, not only America, but in all of these various places where you see globally, they were able to produce a global system of a global economic system of capitalism that they in turn pull the majority of the world into.
I wanted to spend a little bit of time too, because when I looked that word up, when we were problem solving earlier, I looked it up and it said it means willingness to comply, which means there was a level of deceit that was used to trick people into thinking that it was, I mean, these are the people that you should serve. And then even when they stepped outside of Europe and came to the other lands, Africa, the Caribbean and all of that, you know, it was this, you know, after beating you senseless and everything, there was this level of, okay, well, but you need to understand that this is the way it should be. These are people that you should serve, respect, and, you know, and it makes for a better slave. So I really appreciated him putting that in there, and I also appreciated what you were talking about earlier, like when he comes down here, he starts out with the natural, like it's kind of the natural progression of the world economy from.
Wait, girl, you about to get into my hashtag?
Oh,
read that back.
Okay, well, let's read some of these comments. So, Ron, thank you for sharing, Cameron. Ron said, tools in today's age are smartphones with algorithms which try to steer us away from understanding Pan-Africanism. Black Power Karina and Black Power Katrina and Erica. And then Red said that having the ability to feed, clothe, house, educate, inform, and protect the political and military interests of our own people, along with controlling the means of making, manufacturing, producing, distributing, buying, and selling everything for our own people that we need, garners
I think you're about to say it right.
hegemonic power for our people. That's what Europe suppressed in Africa to keep us all dependent of white imperialists. That's why Africa was underdeveloped. I love Walter Rodney's work. It's brilliant. So you've read this, huh?
Okay. He fat too.
So intense. So,
yeah.
Okay, yeah. I want to get to your read that back, but yeah.
We're going to go back, but I just, it was some other things that, Brother Walter spoke to, and even I think it alludes to what the comment that was just made by Red, and it says, the greater quantity of goods and services were based on greater skill and human inventiveness. Man was liberated in the sense of having more opportunities to display and develop his talents. Whether man uplifted himself in a moral sense is open to dispute. The advance in production increased the range of powers which sections of society had over other sections, and it multiplied the violence, which was part of the competition for survival and growth among social groups.
Keyword competition.
Yes, exactly. And so, I mean, that just pretty much, speaks to what we were saying earlier. When you have a greater quantity of goods, man, again, that certain sector, the bourgeoisie, the so-called ruling class or whatever, is able to develop and, display his talents. Just like, how is a peasant supposed to feel when you see a knight that's riding through, the town or the city or whatever that is in this polished, silver armor and things of that nature, and then you have the peasant who is dressed in rags and and pretty much living in in poverty. How does that peasant or how does that slave internalize that display of that gap in wealth? And again, it's this small sector versus the masses of the people. So, yeah. So, I guess we can get into our hashtag read that backs. Or was there anything else you wanted to raise?
No, I mean, this is so much, but no. I mean, you go ahead and do your hashtag read that back.
Oh, okay.
I think we had the same one.
Yeah. Well, I think we can, what I wanted to, speak to, because what Brother Walter also speaks to, is the different, the phases that we see within each, change within, social structures. And that comes where he speaks to, let's say, where was it? Okay, where he says, the key feature is that at given junctures, the social relations in the society were no longer effective in promoting advance. Indeed, they began to act as brakes on the productive forces and therefore had to be discarded. Take, for instance, the epoch of slavery in Europe. However morally indefensible slavery may have been, it did serve for a while to open up the mines and agriculture plantations in large parts of Europe, and notably within the Roman Empire. But then those peasants who remained free had their labor depressed and underutilized because of the presence of slaves. The slaves were not disposed to work at any task requiring skills, so the technological evolution of society threatened to come to a halt. Furthermore, the slaves were restless, and the slave revolts were expensive to put down. The landowners, seeing their estates going to ruin, decided that it would be best to grant the legal freedom for which slaves were clamoring, and to keep exploiting the labor of these free serfs by ensuring that they had no lands to plow other than those of the landlords. Thereby, a new set of social relations, that of landlord and serf, replaced the old relations of slave master and slave. Now, why I think this is very important for us to understand, because this is where we see the transition of, Europe leaving the social structures of feudalism, which was a dying social structure, then the advent of capitalism. So just like we said, we understand that, there was slavery in Europe, but like Walter lays out, the serfs, the peasants who weren't slaves or whatever, their work was being taken up by, the slaves. And then the slaves were rebelling and all of that other kind of shit like that. And so you have that going on. And then you have to also add into the fact that Europe was, this barren place that didn't, that was very harsh upon, the white people that were living there. And then on top of that, you have to add on the fact of the historical, and I don't know why white people like to forget that half of the world's population of white people was, killed off by the bubonic plague. So you have all of these contradictions that, Europe is facing at this moment. Then you have, these capitalists, who come into the picture, like those who financed Christopher Columbus to build those ships, to go out into the world and so-called discover all of these different lands. All of that was funded by these individuals who saw that feudalism was a dying social structure. So therefore they had they had to do something in order to pull themselves up out of this, this state of crisis. You can't have a sound working economic, structure when half of the population is living in disease and is dying, as a result of it. So therefore, you have capitalists who invest their monies into different ventures of, like, again, Christopher Columbus coming to the Americas and all of the other places that we see, the Caribbean, South America, North America, Africa, the capitalist individuals, this is the advent that we see where enslavement, slavery, all of these different devices came as a result, of feudalism, which was a social structure dying away.
Mm-hmm.
So,
just in the benefit of the European, so that they could serve their interests.
Mm-hmm.
It just had nothing to do with, I think a lot of times we get caught up in the moral sense of it, and I'm glad that he said that the way he did, because he made a point to materialize what slavery meant to the European and how it served their interests. When he said that however morally indefensible slavery has been, it did serve for a while to open up the mind to agricultural plantations. So he lays that out in a material sense and not a moral sense, like, oh my God, how could these white people do this to us? Mm-hmm. And that's that's our mistake now, is that we feel like a moral sense should appeal to them to do the right thing, and we cannot anticipate that, and that's what this lays out.
Non-existent. And even after that, he goes into say, because you have to understand that, okay, so you had the slave and the slave master. Mm-hmm. That is done away with in Europe. Then you usher in the feudalism period, where you have the landlord and the serfs who are tied to the land and to the landlord. Mm-hmm. Then you have the capitalists. So now at this point in time, you have the capitalists who are competing with the landlords, because the landlords understand that if capitalists, are able to, usher in capitalism, then their old way of living is then discarded. And they understood what was at stake. Just like, the capitalists understood that feudalism is a dying social structure. So therefore, this is our time, to take over. And he says, when classes are so well defined, their consciousness is at a high level. Both the landlord class and the capitalists recognized what was at stake. The former fought to hold on to the social relations which no longer corresponded to the new technology of the machine production and organization of work by means of purchasing labor power. Therefore, capitalists who were purchasing the labor power of the serfs are the peasants who were tied to the land. The capitalists flung themselves into revolutions in Europe in the 18th and 19th century to break the old relations of production. So now, we had our first Forging the Hammer political education study for the membership of Black Hammer, and Comrade Ghazi gave this really deep and profound explanation of the so-called white working class. Now you have to understand that as feudalism is dying, there is no work for the peasants. There is no work for the serfs and things of that nature. So the capitalists at that time employed the serfs and the peasants by sending them off to different places in the world. Again, like we said, North America, South America, the Caribbean, Asia, and all those different things, to literally kill, enslave, and to take the land in these different places. Like, that whole notion of scalping and things of that nature, like queens and kings in Europe were paying the peasants and the serfs to go to these places, bring back the scalps of the native peoples that they killed in order to get land in the places where they were doing all of this bullshit.
And say what you said earlier, because this is important for them to get. That represents who? The white working class.
The so-called white working class.
That's why we are different. That is the white working class.
Mm-hmm. And now, I mean, things have changed because instead of carrying an axe or, like a gun that they use to kill the indigenous people, you see them in business suits and ties and owning corporations and all of that other kind of shit like that. But from every corporation like Walmart, Whole Foods, and every institution that you see within America and all over the world has its origins in this, in this advent of the so-called white ruling class. Because what we have to understand that there was no work in Europe. There was no work in Europe. So how were these people employed? By going and killing and enslaving us and other indigenous people to the various lands that they went to. So there is no, when you talk about different unions and all these other kind of stuff like that, all of that has its origins in the blood of African and indigenous people.
Yes.
That's why when you have these white people who are, riding against their bosses and other kind of shit like that, it doesn't mean the same thing for an indigenous or African working class person. It doesn't mean the same thing because as a white person, you're working to have a better seat to where your boss is, versus African indigenous people who are simply fighting to just even make a livable wage.
And it was all created at their expense, at our expense.
Exactly.
The blood is literally on the hands of these people, even today. Rome says, his read that back was, the bourgeois economist in question does not give a historical explanation, nor does he consider that there is a relation of exploitation which allowed parasites to grow fat and impoverish the dependencies, which we haven't gotten there yet because we're reading the first half.
We gonna get there.
But we gonna get there, wrong. We gonna get there.
Yeah, before we get into our hashtag read that back, it was just this other part that I wanted to say, because also in this meeting, what Comrade Ghazi was able to help us understand is the fact that white imperialism basically gives you two choices. Pretty much that capitalism and white imperialism is a good system, that is good, or that is permanent and we can't overthrow it. And you see that, in the celebrations of different white nationalist holidays, such as Thanksgiving, such as Christmas, all of these different holidays that make you feel some type of cheer, about, or make you feel a sense of pride about living in America and all of those different things like that. Or, even when you have the understanding that the system isn't good, that it's trash, they make you think that it's permanent. Oh, how can we fight them? They got bombs, they got guns, and all this other type of shit like that. But what Brother Walter says in this book, and I'm going to read it now, and it says, it can be offered as a generalization that all phases of development are temporary, are transient, and are destined sooner or later to give way to something else. It is particularly important to stress this with reference to capitalism because the capitalist epoch is not quite over, and those who live in a particular point in time often fail to see that their way of life is in the process of transformation and elimination. Indeed, it is one of the functions of those bourgeois writers who justify capitalism to try and pretend that capitalism is here to stay. A glance at the remarkable advance of socialism over the last 50-odd years will show that the apologists for capitalism are spokesmen of a social system that is rapidly expiring.
Oh yeah, they had to get rid of it.
It's expiring. You see?
Yeah.
Now we understand why they had to assassinate Brother Walter. And then we see Cuba, a socialist government, in all of these different places, who live in socialism. So, that's just evidence, as he says also in this chapter, that you can tell that capitalism is dying out because it's no way that capitalism and socialism should be operating at the same time. So, yeah. Now we can get into our hashtag read that back.
Okay.
So, let me see. Okay, so my hashtag read that back comes on page 6. And in it states, in the natural sciences, it is well known that in many instances, quantitative change becomes qualitative after a certain period. The common example is the way that water can absorb heat, a quantitative process, until at 100 Celsius it changes to steam, a qualitative change of form. Similarly, in human society, it has always been the case that the expansion of the economy leads eventually to a change in the form of social relations. Karl Marx, writing in the 19th century, was the first writer to appreciate this, and he distinguished within European history several stages of development. The first major stage following after simple bands of hunters was communalism, where property was collectively owned, work was done in common, and goods were shared equally. So even Europe at one point in time was a communal society. It was a communal society. The second was slavery, caused by the extension of domineering elements within the family and by some groups being physically overwhelmed by the others. Slaves did a variety of tasks, but their main job was to produce food. The next stage was feudalism, where agriculture remained the principal means of making a livelihood, but the land which was necessary for that purpose was in the hands of the few, and they took the lion's share of the wealth. The workers on the land, now called serfs, were no longer the personal property of the masters, but were tied to the land of a particular manor or estate. When the manor changed hands, the serfs had to remain there and provide goods for the landlord, just keeping enough to feed themselves. Just as the child of a slave was a slave, so the children of serfs were also serfs. Then came capitalism, under which the greatest wealth in society was produced not in agriculture but by machines, in factories and in mines. Like the preceding phase of feudalism, capitalism was characterized by the concentration in a few hands of ownership of the means of producing wealth, and by unequal distribution of the products of human labor. The few who dominated were the bourgeoisie, who had originated in the merchants and craftsmen of the feudal epoch, and who rose to be industrialists and financiers. Meanwhile, the serfs who were declared legally free to leave the land and to go in search of employment in capitalist enterprises, aka man the slave ship, aka go and bring back some indigenous scalps to us. Their labor thereby became a commodity, something to be bought and sold.
Yep. Yeah. Wow, that was heavy.
Yeah.
But I appreciated the progression from communalism all the way into capitalism, because that was it's necessary to understand how that even came to be. How, again, we're talking about development here, and how development was relatable to why we went from communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism. And now we're looking at the Sam Waltons of these large corporations. Again, that's capitalism, how we can see capitalism has exploded into what it is today. But they started out as these merchants, and they exploited the fuck out of.
And just to even to further the point, because he also goes on to say, the notions of revolution and class consciousness must be borne in mind when it comes to examining the situation of the modern worker and present classes in Africa. Listen to this. However, for the greater part of Africa's history, the existing classes have been incompletely crystallized, and the changes have been gradual rather than revolutionary. Yes. So in this part, he's talking to how Europe interrupted this process within Africa for us to even advance beyond, those social structures and things of that nature, and that the changes have been gradual rather than revolutionary, and that only leads me to understand, just the institution of these puppet governments that have been placed in Africa, by European, and white imperialist powers, who only further crystallize the development, the advancement, of the societal changes that needed to happen in Africa. So
yeah, that was good. I haven't read that back, but it's on page 13.
Where it starts at?
Yeah, it's right.
Well, if your page after mine, so it might be on the page.
So it's
before.
right. Yeah, it's right before.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
So I'm gonna read it. It says they very seldom try to grapple with the issue in its totality, but rather concentrate attention narrowly. Where he's talking about the bourgeoisie here, in defense of keeping capitalism permanent, but rather concentrate attention narrowly on economic development, as defined by the average bourgeois economist. Development becomes simply a matter of the combination of factors of production, namely land, population, capital, supply and demand, technology, specialization, and large-scale production. Those factors are indeed relevant, as is implied in the analysis so far. But omissions from the list of what bourgeois scholars think relevant are really overwhelming. No mention is made of the exploitation of the majority, which underlay all development prior to socialism. No mention is made of the social relations of productions or classes. No mention is made of the way that the factors and relations of production combine to form a distinctive system or mode of production, varying from one historical epoch to another. No mention is made of imperialism as a logical phase of capitalism, which means that they are in denial about the fact that this system is going to dissipate, whether it's by revolution or it's just going to fall the fuck apart, and that's something to take note of. And I also appreciated his breakdown of what imperialism is as a natural phase of capitalism. So
I wanted to say, oh my gosh, can it please come back? Okay. African and indigenous people have historically always been a communal or socialist people. And historical evidence proves that. So much so, you even see that, in the journals of the conquistadors, or however the hell you say that shit, the Spanish soldiers that came from Spain to colonize, the indigenous people of the Americas, how they even wrote in journals how we lived as a communal people, that everything was shared amongst everybody. And we do understand that in Africa, you did have monarchs and things of that nature. You had kings and queens, but the difference between the kings and queens that you see in England or in Europe and the ones that you see in Africa is the fact that the kings and the queens in Africa were appointed by the people. They were appointed by the people. And even when you look at, when those early times when Europe was invading, Africa, the queens and the kings spoke in the defense of the people. Who was the Queen Zenga, who put her people to the forefront. And I believe where she is, this is the sister.
No, Nyah. We're talking about Nyah. We're talking about Nyah Asawante.
It's so many. I can't.
We're talking about Nyah because we just read about this.
Yeah.
We're talking about Nyah Asawante.
Versus in Europe, in a feudalistic society, it was believed that the king and the queen was ordained by God. So therefore, you as a peasant or a serf, you had to see them, as that somebody that was appointed by this omnipotent force that you couldn't question, and all this other type of shit like that. And that's even indicative of how, exactly. Yeah. That's indicative of how different, our social structures were. And he says right here in this point that socialism has advanced on imperialism's weakest flanks in the sector that is exploited, oppressed, and reduced to dependency. In Asia and Eastern Europe, socialism released the nationalist energies of colonized peoples. It turned the goal of production away from the money market and towards the satisfaction of human needs. It has eradicated bottlenecks such as permanent unemployment and periodic crisis, and it has realized some of the promise implicit in Western or bourgeois democracy by providing the equality of economic condition which is necessary before one can make use of political equality and equality before the law. So this is nothing new to us. Socialism, communism, this is nothing new to African and indigenous people. So for this, and like we said, we have to go back to a better way of life.
To me, it just outlines the fact that, eventually, you realize capitalism is exploitative as fuck. And then the people, the masses of people, will get to a point, just as in the natural progression of things, that, socialism is basically returning to that first state where things were shared among everybody. So I appreciate his breakdown of that thoroughly, because this is where the people come to the forefront to say, okay, yeah, enough of this. We're not going to be exploited. We know what's happening to us, and we are going to get it to where we have the ability to control our lives, our land, and our resources. And just to kind of add on, socialism has reinstated the economy quality of communalism, but communalism fell apart because of low economic productivity and scarcity. Socialism aims at and has significantly achieved the creator of plenty, so that the principle of egalitarian distribution becomes consistent with the satisfaction and the wants of all members of society. Yeah. So it's just really a return to what was in place to begin with, except now we've had the economic development to keep it to where everybody has a good quality of life.
Black power. Can we read some of the comments?
We sure can. Rome said, read that back. Development becomes a matter. Did I read that already?
Oh, no.
Okay. Development becomes simply a matter of the combination of given factors of production, namely land, population, capital, technology, specialization, and large-scale production. These factors are indeed relevant, but omissions, imperialism, and mode of production from the list of what bourgeois scholars think relevant are really overwhelming. Yeah, absolutely. That was page 13. Robert Vaney says, if capitalism were to continue indefinitely, at some point all of the wealth, military power of the world will be in one person or family's hands. Can we imagine that world? That's a scary thought. Miriam says, this is such a great choice to share and provide analysis of the readings. Many victories to your union. Bless, bless, bless. And so
Black power.
Yeah, we appreciate all that because this is an important read, like already.
A very, very important read. I believe, like, for the activists of the time when this book, first came out, it was able to, not only change it, but to advance the trajectory that we saw, within the revolutionary height of the 60s and things of that nature, because, at that point in time, it was a lot about, black nationalism and just having pride in being black and things of that nature. But this book was able to advance it beyond that question to, how did we get to this place? How did we become colonized? How did we come to live under capitalism? And, what role Africa played in all of this. And so now for the Revolutionary Book Trap to be taking on this book now, I believe is only going to advance, what we're trying to do. Because, even before we started reading this book, again, I just really appreciate, how this is able to put into context the way things have come to be. Because when you historically can understand how we got here, then you understand where we need to go and then how to get there. I just really, my comrades, to the viewers, members of Black Hammer, we all really need to participate in this study. Yes. Because it's only going to deepen our political line, and it's also only going to help us realize the goals that we want to achieve, in our work to, secure the liberation of African and indigenous colonized people all over the world. So everybody needs, I really, 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 truly want to encourage you that if you don't have the PDF for this book, hit Black Hammer up on any of our social media platforms so we can give it to you for free so you can follow along, because all of us, we need to be participating in this.
We do. And I was just going to say, and just being transparent, when I read the first half of this chapter, and I'm saying this because, one, I've never read this book before. I've heard about it. It's been on my reading list for a minute, but I've never read this book before. But this is one of them things, this part of this chapter, and I suspect it's going to be like this throughout the entire book. It was something I had to reread in order to internalize it. So I was telling my comrade when we got here that it took me a while, because this is different from reading an autobiography with a recollection of what's happened to somebody, which is also just as important. But this is a historical account, again, like my comrade just said, of how we got here. And if we don't understand how we got here to begin with, the progression of development and economic development and social development, then how do we know what to do to go forward? Socialism is where we want to be, and it is going to be freeing because we will actually be able to, we as the people are the state. We
control the means of production.
Right. There won't be any cop killers. There won't be any unjustified deaths in that regard because we have demolished the class system that has its foot on our neck. Because of how the system came to be to begin with, how capitalism was born in its very nature is parasitic. So when we read this and we understand, it's more than just reading a book and coming together and being an elite group of intellectuals and it's like, let's talk about this and yeah, we're smart and all this stuff like that. We need to put this into practice. That's what we're trying to do. And so, yeah, we're not just sitting up here doing this every Sunday because I do love to read and I like something that, me and my comrade, we like to hang around each other, but this is our lives. Yeah. So, it's so important. So invite somebody.
Please invite somebody.
Invite somebody, and we appreciate your ideas and that and if, again, my comrade said it earlier, if you have something that's on your bookshelf, hashtag what's on your bookshelf, put it in the comments, and so we can look at reading that. Donate if you haven't already to BH Book Club. Yes. You can go to GoFundMe, www.gofundme.com/Black Hammer, or what's the other one? Oh, you can go to the website directly. www.blackhammer.org/donate. And you can also become a member today by going to www.blackhammer.org/sign-up. And me and my committee will hit you up and we will follow up with you so that you can get in on this excellent work that we're doing.
All right, so y'all got some homework for next Sunday. So we're going to start at the next subtitle, which is What is Underdevelopment? And then we're going to read all the way up into chapter 2. Now, y'all, this is a 6-chapter book. And you see how thick this book is?
6
So
chapters.
it's a lot. It's definitely a lot of important information in this book. So from What is Underdevelopment up until chapter 2. Also, the next part of your homework is to bring your hashtag read that back portion. So for those of you, if you don't know what that is, hashtag read that back is where we discuss, parts of the chapter that, stood out to us, or maybe that was difficult for us to understand, or we feel like we need more, more understanding or discussion around it. So make sure you have that too. So yeah. Also, don't forget that we go live every Tuesday for Black Hammer's public meetings, so you can get an understanding of Black Hammer, how we operate as an organization, again, how you can become a member and all of that good stuff like that. And also look forward to the announcement of our next Atlanta food drive here in Atlanta, and I'm sure comrades in other units in other cities are planning theirs as well too. So just stick around for that, and we will see you guys next Sunday for the Revolutionary Book Trap. Black Power.
Black Power, y'all.